Okay. This essay addresses Jeffrey Rubinoff's concept of cultivated ignorance as applied to post-baby boomer generation's lack of awareness of the major turning points in 20th century world history. It was written for the May 2010 Jeffrey Rubinoff Sculpture Park Company of Ideas Forum, at which scholars are invited to present aspects of this history as related to Rubinoff's concept of the end of the age of agriculture. Rubinoff's question. Throughout the preparations for the forum, Jeffrey Rubinoff asked me whether I could explain my generation's profound lack of awareness of the historical context of what he has termed the end of the age of agriculture. For Rubinoff, the consequences of not learning from the industrialized mass slaughters of the 20th century are a likely repeat in the 21st. This essay is a response on behalf of my generation, the post-baby boomers, to this question. It is not a knowledge claim subject normally to more rigorous standards of evidence, but a judgment. As such, it is meant for those sufficiently familiar with the facts that I will discuss to evaluate the usefulness of my arguments. This judgment of the post-baby boomer generation is drawn from over 15 years of experience working intensely with several hundred young people of this generation as an educator, mentor, and coach. As well, it profits from my subsequent work within agencies that set international social policy agendas. That is why I must briefly digress so that you may understand the professional background informing the argument that I will present. I am among few of my, or perhaps any generation, that contends seriously at an early age and consistently over long periods of time with a wide range of cultural, economic, political, and technological challenges. Throughout the past 15 years, I've developed and tested various techniques to influence consumer, business, and industry behavior related to environmental protection. I've worked to increase young people's engagement in public policy through participation in official government delegations, to international negotiations, establishing national youth representative institutions, and developing inclusive local government methodologies in Africa. Recently, I worked with the United Nations to test urban entrepreneurship models to address the unemployment of the growing youth population within African slums. I then worked as a UN policy lobbyist, successfully advocating the passage of international social and environmental policy. I subsequently became a United Nations consultant on a program that showcases the potential for art for the empowerment of the young urban poor. In short, as a member of my generation who has been highly involved in social issues, working directly with young people as well as with policymakers and researchers on international social issues, I feel that I can make an informed commentary on Rubinoff's question, the danger of cultivated ignorance at the end of the age of agriculture. Rubinoff has described the end of the age of agriculture as the breakdown of the implicit social contract between the warrior class and the rest of society. Throughout the progressive development of agriculture and other techniques of mass production, the specialized warrior class approached the technological limits of war as a gainful social strategy. History seems to show that war tends to escalate to the upper limits of technology and strategy, regardless of the established cultural norms or taboos. The advent of strategic bombing, for example, eroded the distinction between civilians and combatants, which was fully erased with the development of nuclear weapons. War is often an existential struggle, and there's no reason to think that those motivated by survival will not resort to the most powerful means at their disposal. At the end of the age of agriculture, war has reached a technological, strategic, as well as moral limit. Rubinoff contends that the implicit social contract of the warrior class during the age of agriculture was protection in exchange for subjugation. However, as the rationale for their moral claim was dissolved by the demonstrated rational limits of total war, we must ask the question, what of the warrior class? Does it remain dangerously on an inertial path? Do they pronounce new rationales that are unwittingly accepted? Are there new institutions worthy of displacing their primacy as protectors of life and property? The dangers of a generation who does not have the means to think productively about these questions surely must be clear, even in the absence of imminent global conflict. Merely assuming the indefinite extension of the absence of global conflict seems just as dangerously cavalier, just as dangerous as cavalierly coasting on the work of previous generations who built the firewalls that have mitigated conflict thus far. These include institutions that work to quell the various perceived causes of war and conflict: comparative scarcity, expansionist ambition, defensive reaction, misunderstandings, rage, desperation, or honor. Global trading regimes have made it more effective to trade for goods than to invade the territory in which they are produced. Multinational normative regimes, such as the United Nations, discredit imperialist ambitions and mitigate the psychological causes of conflict. balance of power politics, military alliances, as well as periodic multinational military interventions work to raise, for would-be belligerents, the cost of war on anything but the most serious grounds. However, as the moral and practical threshold for war is raised, surely one of the most difficult causes to address is conflicting ideologies of absolute truth. Absolute truth is based on the notion of a transcendent point of reference for human knowledge about existence. Materially, even psychologically, empirical conflicts are amenable, at least in theory, to pragmatic resolution through economic or diplomatic compromise. The belligerents at least implicitly recognize, to some degree, a common moral or institutional order. They recognize the possibility of common ground. However, conflicts of absolute truth occur outside a shared frame of reference, and thus exhibit their danger in the absolute and irredeemable exclusion of the other from one's own moral territory. For absolute truth, there can be no shared moral territory. Indeed, it seems that in the age of weapons of mass slaughter, there is a constant danger of conflicts over absolute truth escalating to the use of absolute weapons. It has been left to the succeeding generations to apply their imaginative intelligence to mitigate this remaining danger of the age of agriculture. Post-boomer generations X, Y, and Z. For my generation, roughly speaking the children of the baby boomer generation, the distance of personal experience with the survivors of the world wars is great. For the next generations, their personal psychological connection, even to the Cold War and to the various proxy wars such as Vietnam, Korea, etc., is slight, if any. However, the ignorance of the trauma of the industrialized mass death of the 20th century conflicts cannot be solely explained by the distance from personal experience. Otherwise, vital lessons would have to be learned time and time again, and humanity would never have maintained great civilizations. Upon reflection on Rubinoff's question, and in attempting to formulate an answer for this forum, I was struck by the realization that my generation scarcely thinks much about war at all, and much less nuclear war. Again, part of this is my geographical perspective, since for those now living in Western societies, war is something perpetrated upon the territory of the other, not something to be experienced directly. Most of my generation is at least one, if not two generations removed from a family member who experienced war or the existential threat of war directly. My mother was born in Germany during the middle of World War II and has told me of the terrifying drone of the bombers and recounted what it was like to grow up among the ruins of Berlin. My grandmother and relatives explained the horror of those times to me, recounting personal stories of women and children conscripted into the final futile defense of Berlin. As a boy attending high school in Berlin, I was required to make a visit to a concentration camp. By intentional design, my school was a mix of children of marginalized migrant workers as well as socially advantaged classes. As a group, they exhibited great contempt of authority, but not one student took the concentration camp tour lightly. This was likely as close to the personal experience of the great wars of my generation gets, and most of the post-baby boomer generation does not have the privilege of that direct a source of knowledge. However, given all that personal access, university training, and professional career in social policy, I have yet to fully come to terms with this history. Now, war and mass slaughter is so morally repugnant that there is likely a natural aversion to thinking about it, especially in the many decades during which conflicts seem either abstract or of a reduced scale and in distant lands. In these circumstances, it is likely that no great number spend much time thinking about such unpleasant topics. Moreover, I have observed among my generation that only a small minority end up in vocations whose primary inputs and outputs are ideas of great importance to society. Of those, the majority are, by necessity of time pressures and coherence to their institutional mandates, primarily consumers of ideas. Still fewer are involved in the generation of new ideas. Less yet have had enough experience to judge the merit of their ideas by real-world application. I am a junior member of this very small group. So the deeper implications of Rubinoff's question of my generation in general really must be reflexively posed as a question to myself as a representative of my generation. How can a person who has personal access to the experience of World War II and the Holocaust, who is educated and has been practically engaged in the creation and application of social ideas for over 15 years, not have come to terms with the consequences of this history? If one subtracts the influence of obvious factors such as time, distance from personal experience, and the general repugnance of thinking of war, I think the answer must be that the ignorance to this reality has been cultivated, either consciously or unconsciously. With the benefit of reflection, it now seems obvious to me that you cannot ignore war as a persistent feature of human civilization since the advent of agriculture. Thus, this cultivated ignorance, unconscious, structured, or deliberate, must constitute a large part of the answer. ideologies of truth. As with others of my generation with the means and opportunity, I was in the fortunate position of choosing a course of university studies. My academic talent from a fairly young age was for science, and my first consideration of a university career was theoretical physics or engineering. My young mind was attracted by certainty of answers about the natural world and not seemingly vague interpretations of the human one. However, thinking seriously about it, I realized that the answers that really mattered to me were going to be about the human world, and though I was untalented in the arts, it was there that I wouldn't have to make my contribution. It was at that point that I diverged paths with those pursuing scientific disciplines, not to rejoin them for many years. It was my impression, years later, jointly researching biofuels technology, that scientists do think seriously about the social implications of the technologies they develop, but that their technical focus precluded sophisticated articulations on social policy matters. Thus, in my experience, the graduates of the arts faculties remain the predominant group self-consciously using and developing social ideas in a professional capacity. So in returning to the question of cultivated ignorance, I'll primarily limit the scope of my judgment to social science disciplines with which I'm more personally familiar, and may illustrate a point you may judge to be more broadly applicable. What I experienced throughout my education in various social sciences was that most of the knowledge was presented as a confused mix of history, ideology, statistical data, and logical models. The excuse for this muddle was that the field, being in its infancy and having such a nebulous object of study, was necessarily methodologically heterogeneous. Within a field that cannot settle on conventions of what constitutes knowledge, the minimum one would expect is the illumination of the ontological and epistemological claims of its various conventions of knowledge. Notwithstanding those honest educators for whom this is the norm, a more significant criticism is the underemphasis on the development of the intellectual tools of judgment of these truth claims. Without this, immature minds must invent a yardstick to judge the merits of this confusing mass of data, rational models, and historical narrative. Unfortunately, this judgment is highly susceptible to the simplifying power of the very ideologies presented for consideration. When contested theories, political agendas, social paradigms, and economic laws are simply presented as knowledge claims without a means of evaluation, students' thought, like water, flows by the path of least resistance. The danger of this laissez-faire approach to social science education is the cultivation of a generation with a cavalier pick-and-choose approach to knowledge claims. The cultivation of the tools and mature habits of judgment is the minimum degree of intellectual discipline, prerequisite of a field that aspires to accumulate systematic knowledge of use to society. Cultivating ignorance by prescriptive narrative in the social sciences. Critiquing social science on its metaphysical obfuscation demands, a deeper analysis of where it went wrong and a proposed course of action. The way I understand the emergence of social science is part of the epistemological shift during the Enlightenment away from transcendental points of reference for the authority of knowledge claims. As the natural sciences discovered seemingly unchanging laws of the natural world, existence as observed and explained by the human mind challenged the authority of religion as the arbiter of truth. It was thought that just as universal laws of nature were being discovered in the natural realm, surely they must also exist in the social realm. There seemed to be a desire to discover universal principles of human society that would serve as the new and more objective authority upon which to base judgments of value. The intellectual paradigm that human history could be reduced to essential principles of action and hence modeled is really the ambition of early social science. My argument is that the extension of the scientific method into the social realm perhaps inadvertently created the conditions for the proliferation of ideologies within that discipline. These ideologies replaced truth claims based on a transcendental arbiter of value, but nevertheless aimed at finding an impersonal and objective point of reference for social values, not dependent on arbitrary preference. On the one hand, it provides a handy foil against the arbitrary authority of wealth, tradition, or force as the basis for truth claims. The objective laws of history, society, and economics could be invoked against naked and obvious self-interest. What could be worse than being out of step with the impersonal and inevitable laws of human history? Social science proceeded along this path for decades, checked only by the realization of the difficulty in drawing sweeping generalizations and thus gradually reducing the scope of its knowledge claims. However, the confused marriage of an academic discipline with a socio-political program is highly problematic. Politics is instrumentally focused and less bothered about the means than the ends. However, we expect academics to be concerned with both. The creative thought, uninhibited from political interference, is one of the most important qualities we have come to expect from public intellectuals. There are two major problems concerning this fused political intellectual paradigm, which are relevant to the cultivated ignorance of the post-boomer generation. The first is a presupposition that history must necessarily be reducible to essential principles and societies to systemic models, and the second, that these principles and models describe existence itself rather than human knowledge. Addressing the first problem, I believe this hidden methodological presupposition of social science leads its students to avoid mental engagement with the narrative of history and absorption of facts in favor of first understanding various models that prescribe a certain explanation of them. The manner of teaching within the discipline conditions young minds to see history and facts as mere instances of impersonal principles and prescribed models. This stifles the novel type of thinking based on the mastery of the collective memory which generated these principles and models in the first place. Generations of students are thus conditioned to think like photocopies of ever-decreasing fidelity. The second objection with early social science and its ambition to develop knowledge conventions that provided descriptions of existence. Rather than viewing human knowledge as models of variable reliability used to describe and predict human observations, it assumes that models reliably characterize the intrinsic existence from which those observations emerge. This represents an obsolete metaphysical view of reality, which natural science emerged from in the early 20th century. Around the same time, a new perspective was being formulated in the crucible of an intense debate about how to interpret quantum mechanics in natural, non-mathematical, classical physics language. Niels Bohr articulated an interpretation of quantum mechanics which argued that quantum physics can model the material world in a manner usefully described and predicted observations, while discounting the usefulness of classical concept of intrinsic properties as independent of a physical system's interaction with an experimental apparatus. Jeff Foss calls this approach of contemporary science metaphysical modesty, which is really in the business, as he puts it, of modeling extrinsic properties and essentially doesn't attempt to explain the intrinsic nature of nature. This is a powerful statement of ontological agnosticism, but which leaves room for a robust epistemological convention for the human observation of nature. Social science apparently did not benefit from the realization that natural science arrived at in the earliest 20th century until much later. My recollection of early social science paradigms is that most staked a claim to truth in the domain of intrinsic properties of existence. Marxism was perhaps one of the most powerful social science paradigms and was explicitly ideological. As can be seen in such Marxist concepts as false consciousness, the ideology asserts a truth claim within a domain that is prior to perception. Marxist class analysis is the true representation of your interests, regardless of any other analysis or what you may personally perceive. Marxism claims its truth pertains to the domain of infrastructural material existence, thus trumping your own distorted superstructural knowledge. By claiming to reliably represent existence, ideologies become weapons in the struggle over absolute truth. But it would take until the 1960s for what we now label as the postmodern critique of social theory to emerge to challenge these sorts of claims. Reading the postmodern critique charitably, we must view it within a historical context and assume it to be logically coherent. We must also acknowledge that many of the so-called founding thinkers distance themselves from the term postmodernism as the description of their philosophy. From what I have gathered, and I stand open for correction, the postmodern critique of social science, taken here as a general intellectual movement, challenged the notion that any human narrative could a priori be considered to have primacy over any other. For postmodernists, all knowledge claims are centered in human values, which are necessarily subjective and laden with power dynamics. Those who cannot enforce their values cannot create knowledge and are thus disempowered. Marxist knowledge is thus a knowledge for the benefit of workers, structural functionalist knowledge for the benefit of social conservatives, and so on. Knowledge is admittedly and now inescapably political as well as personal. As far as I've been able to see, the originators of these ideas, the ideas that facilitated postmodern critique, Baudrillard, Derrida, Foucault, and Lyotard, preferred to be observers of society and theorists. However, their ideas were championed by another group of academics who took them as doctrinal prescriptions. To address the power-knowledge imbalance, one now had to have third world knowledge, black knowledge, women's knowledge, gay and lesbian knowledge, and so on. Within this context, it is not difficult to see how my generation can easily dismiss as merely particular history knowledge, war knowledge, science knowledge, or nuclear war knowledge. The tendency towards cultivated ignorance was pre-programmed by our educational context. The postmodern critique pluralized epistemologies of social knowledge, contesting supposedly universal human narrative as politically repressive and retrograde. Unfortunately, this intellectual strategy of discrediting self-proclaimed universal narratives also has the effect of discrediting the idea of a shared human narrative. Without a shared human narrative, human history itself becomes just so many quaint stories, to be ignored for the more fundamental explanatory power of whatever social theory is in fashion. Within this educational context, it's easy to understand why those even who have engaged in the study of society and practice of governance have scant knowledge of the history of the end of the age of agriculture. Towards a shared, human, non-prescriptive narrative. Notwithstanding what I have described as a postmodern critique, the proliferation of global normative regimes is a testament to the fact that for many decades, narrative based on widely shared human values has actively been sought. What is meant by narratives are the conventions of human knowledge by which mental pictures are made meaningful to others. These conventions refer to superordinate values to which individual narratives must cohere. What is meant by non-prescriptive narrative is a process which allows one to judge the content of individual narratives as well as the set of values by which the narratives are judged to be knowledge. Knowledge is assumed to cohere with superordinate set of values, either or, both of which can be agreed or disagreed with. Within this perspective, prescriptive narratives of social scientists attempt to deny the subjective nature of the values that underlie its knowledge conventions. It either asserts them to be universal a priori truth, or based within an authority outside the domain of human values. By fusing the yardstick and the content of knowledge, prescriptive narrative implies its claims refer to the intrinsic non-subjective properties of entities rather than the fallible human meaning given to human perceptions. This has the effect, as mentioned, of stifling the evolution of narratives as new perceptions change the values that underlie the extant conventions of knowledge. The postmodern critique is well taken if its point is that the a priori assertion of universal values upon which to base a convention of social knowledge would inevitably be contested. However, it doesn't follow that human values can never obtain some degree of shared agreement. The postmodern critique may rightly have discredited grand meta-narratives which generate the kind of absolute truths almost pre-programmed to conflict. Notwithstanding, I argue that efforts to identify shared human values upon which to build non-prescriptive narrative are highly useful. This process generates narratives which are self-admittedly fallible, truth by convention, but nevertheless strives to be based on broadly shared human values. The role of art in cultivating cognizance. If art were merely in the business of reproducing perceptions that are removed in time and space, it would be a dull affair, and most likely have already been fully supplanted by various recording technologies. In my admittedly limited experience, serious artists strive to make statements of value. Statements by the virtue of the identity of their originators are necessarily statements of human values. These statements can be highly articulate or be limited and boring. But for those serious artists attempting to create art of lasting value, these statements emerge from and address the human soul. This emergence is a result of their awareness of the collective memory of humanity, and within that awareness coming to terms with the nuanced tensions between human values therein illuminated. The language in which this is expressed is the language of metaphor, which relies on but does not necessarily prescribe a frame of reference that is shared between the artist and the perceiver. Metaphors, as with any form of knowledge statement, requires that both artist and perceiver consciousness have grappled to a comparable degree with the collective memory. That condition being met, the perceived truth value of a metaphor thus rests on the internal resonance between the artist and perceiver's most sacred values. Thus, art can escape from becoming a prescriptive form of narrative while offering a powerful means to communicate highly nuanced value statements. That is not to say that artists cannot create propaganda art, which asserts a shared frame of reference backed by the threat of physical or spiritual violence. Rubinoff has stated that art is the means to experience the sacred beyond prescriptive narrative. I interpret this statement as Rubinoff's ambition for art and artists to help humanity earn itself a shared frame of reference by their disciplined exploration of the collective memory and a coming to and a coming to terms with the value tensions within the human soul. Concluding thoughts. The age of agriculture ended by reaching the limit of an intellectually and spiritually obsolete state of human consciousness. Absolute truth by reference to supposedly transcendent values has been used to induce and rationalize the mass industrial slaughters of the 20th century. We are indeed lucky to have avoided a repeat performance for over half a century. However, both the machinery of slaughter and the self-destructive habits of thought remain very much intact. Avoiding these negative consequences is not only a matter of dismantling the obsolete machinery of slaughter, but also dismantling the obsolete machinery of thought. If this can be accomplished, we will likely reap as yet unknown positive consequences of the end of the age of agriculture, as well as merely avoiding the negative ones. Artists who choose to take themselves seriously are able to offer metaphorical knowledge formulated in a uniquely powerful language with which to address the question of shared human values. The truth about the human soul is something that essentially must be evaluated experientially, and one highly effective method is being confronted with the intellectual and emotional reality of an artistic statement. However, that is not to discount the need for rigorous and disciplined study of social facts and history as a basis for evolving insight into our evolving species. If we are to move towards shared values upon which conventions of truth may be ever more broadly accepted, we in the disciplines of addressing social issues must make greater efforts to foster auto-illuminative intellectual habits. This may start with a renewed emphasis on cultivating the joy of direct engagement with the current and historical facts, unfiltered by theory. As well, we may redouble our efforts to equipping students of society, social policy practitioners, and the general public with the intellectual tools to evaluate the epistemological and ontological basis for knowledge claims. What is important in our search for a flexible and rigorous basis for understanding our own evolving nature is that we strive to earn shared human values, not by decree, but by evidence of their benefits. We must also realize that human intelligence extends far beyond what is readily observable and articulatable in words. This vast other realm is of vital interest to the majority of human beings, within which truth claims are intuitively evaluated. Art provides one possibility of a metaphorical language to explore this realm, one which can escape the prescriptive narrative of absolute truth. Ultimately, both these approaches can serve not to oppose, but to transform by enlarged understanding past religious, political, or other ideological narrative, while not discrediting the content of their narratives out of hand. Human knowledge thus becomes open to insights from whatever source, so they may be woven into the tapestry of shared human values. And that's it.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much to both speakers, I should say, to which I'd like to address a word or two. The first is I'd like to raise an issue of our living in a transnational moment when the vehicles of transmission of narratives are by and large national. And it may be that one reason for disorientation is that 100 years or more of educational provision has gone into the creation of nation states. And now we're at one of the most extraordinary moments of transnational migration in history. And your life is evidence of that. Not only yours, I think. I've been touched by it too, and many of my students have. We now live in a moment where the nation state is both there and in some sense more porous than it's been for 150 years. How many illegal migrants in the United States? 13 million, 14 million, who knows? Europe is full of illegal migrants. I don't know the Canadian story. More tolerance perhaps reduces the numbers of illegals, but my guess is the problem is pretty much endemic. And I wonder if the issue of what you call cultivated ignorance is actually a structural one, that we're living at an unusual demographic moment where nation states are no longer the repositories of those institutions that transmit knowledge. There are transnational institutions called universities, and they are that now, with huge populations of students coming from everywhere. And there are all kinds of exchange operations. You must have seen them in China as well, where people from one inordinately different language community and experiences exchange happily on the internet or in person with others. So as you found out already, Karen, I'm more optimistic than you are. I don't see this as a moment of blank ignorance of these issues in many parts of the world. I know something about it, and especially in Europe, where I've lived most of my life. And the second point relates, I think, to the need to take that point and put it alongside your use of the term collective memory. And I'd like to suggest that you refine it in terms of dealing with the memory of different collectives. Collective memory is never the memory of everybody. It's always the memory of different collectives. That's what Halbach, the sociologist who invented the concept, meant. He didn't mean the nation state or the world. He meant groups of people who tell each other stories about who they are and who tell their children stories about who they are. We are, in our families, never the first person to know who we are. Our parents tell us who we are. So the concept of the collective memory is really the memory of collectives. And the ones that I've found have borne the message of war in ways that are very powerful and, I would say, acerbic to the triumphalist tradition are families. Where family history and universal history intersect, there the message that war is an abomination is performed. And it's usually performed, I would argue, in another dimension you could add to your paper, in 3 generations. The people who are the great carriers of remembrance are grandparents, who speak over the head of the difficult generation in the middle to their grandchildren. And you have that possibility. You now have a little girl. You're going to find your mother will be engaged in acts of remembrance of the collective, which is your family, collective remembrance, in a way that perhaps wasn't easy for you. And hence, I would like to suggest that the realm of transmission is to locate these narratives within family structures, which, of course, are very powerful within transnational experiences as much as they are within national ones. Gabriel Garcia Marquez said every single one of his stories was learned at his grandmother's knee. Every single one, as fantastic as they might have been. And these 2 moments, the transnational moment and the intersection of family history with the history of violence, strike me as wide open opportunities for there to be cultivated cognizance, as you put it. And I think I'd just like one more sentence to say how this related to my first reflections on what Jeffrey had to say. I take the challenge here to make art dialogic with the past. That's what I take it to be. That postmodernism has basically frozen itself into some degree of concrete by not recognizing that it too has a history and is history, or maybe I should add, was history at one point in time. I think an effort in remembrance in art is not turning your back on the past, but finding ways to measure yourself in terms of it. And we talked a bit about this, Jeffrey. It strikes me that there's the intersection of the 2 themes that we have so far, that what kind of a past is the one that we need to reflect on in order to talk about artistic form and effort. That's one enormously complex and fertile area. But the second one, I really think, is that this is an exciting moment for the construction of different units, different measures of the construction of narratives about the past and the violent past, which unfortunately in most of the world is still going on quite happily. Whether we've distanced ourselves from it is another matter. So I'm hopeful, and I see the effort here, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to come, as a very positive step, which is much more in line with many other steps that I can refer to later on than perhaps you may realize. So in my old age, I'm getting happier, which I think is not an unusual experience. Enough Sturm und Drang at the age of 30, I must say, is enough for one lifetime. But wouldn't you take some positive impulse from these thoughts, rather than necessarily critique on what you said, but some energy to move forward in a direction that I think is open.
You said perhaps that postmodernism is history. Could you define for me what you mean by postmodernism and why it is history?
Okay, I can try. There are a series of, well, I think I have a colleague who could do better than I, but I'll try to say that the attack and assault on the totalitarian character of meta-narratives, of master narratives of existence, started in many different forms, but they came in response to the evident failure of what might be described as a national project in which nations like a few, like parts in a Bach fugue came in one after the other into national consciousness and wound up in the Nazi experience, in which the hopeful and dynamic belief in liberation through a working class turned into Stalin, and in which, and Lyotard is the best case of this, in which the notion of some humanity having some decent restraints on barbarity became utterly contradicted by Auschwitz. So it's the explosion of meta-narratives in which the concept of human values, words that you use, were discredited. And I believe that from the 1980s and 1990s, that interpretation in philosophy, in the art that I know of, I only speak hesitantly, is rather tired and repetitive. And there have been many individuals, you know better than I, who've gone beyond this, I think, cul-de-sac, that it had something to say, but after a while, silence is more or less what it offers, rather than anything else. The twist of postmodernism to say there is no reality, there are only signs, simulacra, all of that, I think is a secondary dimension of the phenomenon, but it's the idea that history is not a story, and if you tell a story, you're totalitarian. Does that sound right?
I think. I mean, it's odd you should ask me. I mean, I think that postmodernism is a grand meta-narrative. I mean, and it pretends. It makes a valid point. I think Kroon is right. There is the sense that every claim to knowledge, in the end, is part of a structure of domination of thought. In many cases, domination of action. That values and truth are somehow connected, but when it goes so far, as you say, to say that there's only texts, there's only the things we say, there is no independent reality, it just seems to fly in the face of what you might call manifest fact. It is a manifest fact that there was a Second World War. It was a manifest fact. I mean, that's a concept, I admit. Second World War is a concept. We all know what we're talking about. And that there were these sort of twin holocausts, nuclear holocaust and the holocaust of the extermination. That's the extermination of the Second World War. I mean, these are facts. Right? So, I mean, sometimes I don't know post-structuralism. I look at postmodernism, post-structuralism, the idea that we could somehow go past the goals that humankind has set for itself. Some days it looks like an evasion. Some days it looks like none of us were guilty. Guilt would require a system of values to say we were guilty. Something happened. There was a lot of noise. The war was over. I wasn't there. I don't know. Sometimes it looks like that. Sometimes I see, as it were, particularly European people trying to explain away this event or somehow deny that it happened. And I think that's your point, isn't it, Kroon? I mean, it creates an invitation, in a sense, to not think about.
I mean, I can, in addressing your, I mean, me and Jenny are the same vintage, roughly, right? Almost exactly. So we were going to school in the 90s, or, yeah. And so, I mean, what my paper argues, in a nutshell, is that well, first of all, there was the remnants of the professors who were kind of against postmodernism still teaching in the classical social theory mode, which was largely Marxist and largely theory first, history later. So, I mean, if summing up my paper, it's like critiquing the theory first approach to the study of social issues and the humanities. So that's how we were taught. And so I say, you know, history are sort of mere case studies within the larger theory. That's how you come to think about reality, as you know, how does an event fit within your already prescribed model of how things should unfold? And then the postmodern critique kind of smashed that concept, right? This sort of story that you could tell before the events got filled in, right? So it was like kind of having a, you know, fill in the dots, or, you know, connect the dots is the theory. And so postmodernism said, no, you can't have the connect the dots and have a prescribed way of connecting them and have a prescribed picture. There are no dots, and, you know, there is no real picture. There's no real picture. There are pictures, but the pictures are in your mind, right? So you're not describing something by drawing the lines between the dots. Actually, I'm not, I mean, to me, it was a critique. I don't really feel like postmodernism is a productive theory. I think it's a critique, sort of a going too far, and of a sort of a methodology. So what I'm proposing, and again, when I wrote this paper, I was kind of shocked at my own, I guess, the intensity of what came out. So I left it the way it was, but I didn't know that that's what I was thinking until I started writing it. And I said, wow, I can't really, that's heavy duty stuff. And but I do believe in the idea of a shared new human narrative. And part of the reason why I work with the United Nations, as totally messed up as that institution is that's one place where I can feel like I can express that, and other people are working towards those human values that they're trying to earn their place by evidence of their usefulness. And it's interesting what you're saying about the cognizance within families, and I think my mind immediately goes to my family when I think about those very profound issues. How does this, war passed on? So I made the point in my paper that how do you not think about war? I mean, you've been educated. How did it come that just war doesn't come up as anything that you think about much? I mean, you hear about it. It's sort of over there somewhere, and people come back and they say things about it. But it's not like it's a major dimension in your thinking.
A couple of things come to mind. When you say that, why do you think about work doesn't come up? But then I think about the 9/11, and as nasty as it was, but the propagandizing of what we've been doing with 9/11 and the rationale of the politicians to establish policy based on fear. And then I also, when you're saying that most younger people, post-baby boomers, I'm thinking post-1965, example, and you said that they're not really caring, or they don't care about things like this. And I'm thinking about the evaluation of the apparent negativity of the American public to educated people. Look at the elections. You look at an Al Gore, you look at somebody like that, and anyone who was educated at what we consider a fine institution somehow gets this negative aura in the American public's mind. Personally, I don't want to go having Joe Sixpack as my president, but it seems like many of the American people do. And I'd like to bring that up as a discussion item in context with what you're saying in your papers. Is people aren't looking to history. You get somebody, take the current monetary policy, you get somebody like a Bernanke or a Geithner who looks in the 30s and sees things that we should have learned from monetary policy that they're trying to implement. You get a Congress which is so divided that it probably couldn't decide on its own name, but certainly in implementing policy that reflects on things that have happened in the past. People don't want to look back, and they look upon people who do and who are educated as not being desirable.
Without denying anything that's been said about prescribed pictures of what's happened, or postmodernism, or nationalism, let me make another suggestion that things are not all that different now, or in the post-boomer generation, than they always have been. From my own perhaps warped perspective, I think that 5% of the population is on the far left, 5% is on the far right, and the other 90% don't give a damn. They're the people who are not politically involved, not intellectually involved. And so you have a very limited number of people, a fraction of the population. And I think that they have always been uninterested. They don't know their history. They don't care about their history. For a number of decades at University of California, Santa Barbara, I taught a fairly popular course that I call The Atomic Age. It was about the history of the nuclear arms race. And I remember, say, in the 1990s, I would say something about Ronald Reagan, and the students would say, "Who?" Now, he may have been out of office for a few years, but these students had no concept that this was a fairly recent and significant president. And for them, if they knew the name, he was simply an historical figure. Earlier, the same was true of John Kennedy. Oh, yeah, I heard about him. These are people who have marginal knowledge and even less interest. And I'm talking about students in the University of California who are by and large considered among the better university students. And as an explanation for some of their lack of factual knowledge, they pointed out that the traditional American history course might cover a full year in either high school or college. And the first half, semester one, covers from colonial period to the Civil War, and the second from the Civil War to now. And what does a teacher do who invariably gets tied up with some issue that he or she likes and spends more time on it and comes toward the end of the semester and there isn't enough time to do justice to everything? So you cut out a lot of the more recent stuff. And personally, I think that students get shortchanged by not having courses that go up to the point they're supposed to go up to and treat them adequately. So in general, my point is, hasn't it always been like this?
I mean, I guess I would answer that it can't then continue. I think that my critique is the way that social science is taught. So I mean, that it's the theory-first teaching method that allows you to think that you're learning something before you know any of the history. So that's the problem, because it makes you lose taste. I mean, that's sort of the mere instances, sort of like, okay, well, I don't really need to learn history because I know the theory, and I can just apply these models to any point in history and kind of get a sense of what was going on. So it gives you the sense that you have access to some kind of truth about something prior to spending the time. So I mean, I accept your refinement of collective memory, and I think that what I meant by that was much more generally the human knowledge base, the base that's accessible. So cultivating the joy and this is what, again, the gift that I've been given is that the joy of actually learning about this stuff. And if there's a real shift in sort of intellectual habits that you need to get to, and I don't know if it's just the way that young people are maturing, and as you mature, there's a higher interest, but I don't think so. I think that really is, and I mean, I'm just being really honest, a desire to shortcut some of the tough slogging through all of this history and coming to terms with it. But when you start doing it, it becomes more and more and more exciting. So I think that we're really shortchanging ourselves by not having not going through that tough first part, and then just teaching the Marxism and the Milton Friedman and all those, like doing that first, I don't know that that's a really great way of doing it. In looking at grad schools, I'm really trying to avoid the ones that are really theory-based, because I just don't want that, right? It's hard to have a discussion with somebody when you're just talking about contesting theories. Well, my theory can beat up your theory. The only way to get down to something that's shared is to have some common basis in human knowledge, right? So that's what I meant by that. Okay, I think that pretty much, I'm in responding to you as well, is this, perhaps I'm cynical. I think ultimately I am hopeful. I don't think it's a fatal thing. But again, it's the role, I think, of a 30-something-year-old to be unsatisfied. And I think, I think that we do have to push, and so yes, you do detect that note of, say, not cynicism, but dissatisfaction. So, and partly it's directed at myself, and mostly it's directed at my own lack in these areas, right? So it's not only, I'm using general language, but it's a very personal statement.
I want to put a different spin, which is more downbeat. And that is, I really believe there are periods where we can talk about the diminution of the stock of human knowledge. Not the accretion to it, but the obscuring of truth, which starts right at the top, lies about the weapons of mass destruction. Lying is part and parcel of everyday life in the world in which we live, and clearing away the lies is hard work. One definition of art is clearing away the lies. I really believe that there are artists who are just simply cheat. They cheat on what they do and what they know. And it strikes me that, when we were just reading more generally, that what happened with pop art was a diminution of human knowledge. That something negative happened, not just neutral and all right, let it pass like a thunderstorm. But there was actually, there are moments when people lose sight of what constitutes knowledge, what constitutes creativity. And we have to be aware of the fact that they're there a lot of time. Part of the purpose of a professional education is to teach you what a lie is, not what the truth is. That's much harder. But maybe we know what couldn't be more readily than we know what is. But a lot of people get along, just go along with as it were, with it.
People, though, as a society.
Well, I tend to have a different view on that one. I think it's too generalized. If you think about your own profession, the legal profession is highly technical and highly skilled and highly paid and highly valued.
And highly distorted.
And highly distorted, right. But that's not undervalued. If you think of the medical profession,
No.
highly skilled, highly paid, highly valued. These are people who have great knowledge and keep some of us alive, I would imagine. Certainly in my case, they have it. It isn't all people who have ideas who are, as it were, treated in a negative way, but just some. And some of the time, I think Obama was a professor at Chicago, and everybody knew it. Of course, he was different from George Bush, from my old institution, my current institution. That's true. But then Bill Clinton was a Yale man too, and so is Hillary. So I think there's a hell of a lot of irregularity in this strange animal. But again, just for one brief second, I wonder if it would be useful to say that one of the things that I've benefited from Karen's comment is that, thank God, America isn't the measure of this issue. Thank God, that we're not talking about one country as the centerpiece of the word culture, the word art, and all of that. There's a hell of a lot going on in the 60s that were going on in the pop art. I think, whatever you think of the work, Joseph Beuys and people in Dusseldorf, or Yves Klein in Paris, there were people who were trying. They may have failed, but there was a lot going on, even when there was a series of what we might describe as tin can episodes and commercialized art. So I like to think that the subject could be broadened to incorporate these transnational populations that are coming from Latin America, where intellectuals are highly prized individuals, even in strange countries like Colombia, or very strange countries like Colombia. If we just stretch it within the American experience to include South America, I think it looks a little bit better than that. And my hope is say, to complicate matters by making it transnational.
Yeah, although I think probably other people should speak, and I could get awfully tired of hearing the sound of my own voice. But here's a thought, just a thought, and you know, I agree that forgetting the past is not a good thing. In fact, I'm reminded here of the Lion King, in which the Lion King, when he's younger, has decided to forget all about the wars that go on between his group and the other group. I can't quite remember, within his group. And the wise man comes along and says, "What are you doing?" Eating, I think at this point he's eating slugs and worms and stuff he finds. He's living with warthogs, I believe. And he says, "Well, I've decided to forget about the past. You know, the past has no relevance for me. I'm going to live free, man." And so the wise man bops him on the head and he says, "Ow!" And the guy says, "What are you complaining about?" He says, "You hit me on the head." He says, "Well, it's in the past. It's in the past." And of course, the pain continues, doesn't it? And you have to know why you hurt in order that you can fix what caused the hurt. On the other hand, okay, that's what I want to grant. I'll grant it with my left hand. With my other hand, there is such a thing as dwelling in the past. And there is such a thing as the need to forget. We say forgive and forget. And this brings me to a phrase in Kroon's paper. I just about said Dr. Koenig's. Honorary Dr. Koenig. One of the smartest men I know. Anyways, one of the wise. Anyways, you say this ignorance of this reality has been cultivated. And what I remember was that it was purposely cultivated by my parents in me. I was turned into a flower child. And it wasn't just my parents, but they wanted to forget the damn war. My dad, of course, would drag me out every November 11th. We would remember it on the day it was to be remembered. But the thought was, you guys should live without the thought of war and without the fear of war. You should look towards the future, yes, and you should look towards the future in which peace is conceived as a possibility and is something you live. And one way to stop war is to forget the grudges, bury the hatchet. So I think there was an explicit turning that way. And if we look at life in general, every Robin that lives out there is the inheritor of, as it were, millions of years of Robin Hood, so to speak. And yet the Robin doesn't know a damn thing about it. And the genius of life is to look forward to deal with the present moment, in a sense. We are special, right? We know we're special. We know we don't fit in. I mean, any child of 2 can sees a pizza laying in the woods and realize somebody's been here. I mean, pizza is not a natural object in the same sense anything else is, you know. So we recognize we're very, very different. And part of what makes us different is that we can remember the past. I think we've got to be careful of either turning it into a virtue in itself or turning it into something we should ignore. Now, I think the last generation did try in a lot of ways to make us ignore it. I think we should return to it, but you don't want to remember it in its full pain and agony. I mean, it's one thing to know that I fell off a motorbike. I should remember it so I don't fall off again, but I don't want to go back there and experience all that over again in its full splendor. I don't want to realize it. I want to deal with it, learn from it, and that requires putting it in a kind of conceptual box where it can't hurt me anymore at the same time that I can. So, just a thought.
I just want to say something on that note is like Israel, you know, Israel is sort of in a perpetual state of war as Palestine. And when I was visiting Israel, the one thing that really was striking was that because the state of war is so close at any time, and the remembrance of Auschwitz and what happened is right there, they're in a constant state of creation. So they're constantly in the now, living, creating, you know, and that's what I saw as the height of human endeavor, because, you know, what they've created from sort of nothing to constantly creating to being, you know, ahead in medicine, in, you know, in different areas. And I thought, well, you know, you never forget where you come from, because that's always inherent in who you are, but you can't be attached to it, because then you can't move forward in what you're creating and how you're living every day. So I think there's a tension between the two, and I think even in Afghanistan, you know, you're in a constant state of, you know, war is so close to you that you just have to live, and so you live so closely with what you're engaged in the present.
But if I think it's interesting, Karun, because I mean, I know you live in Germany now, but like the U.S. is at war, and so it's interesting that you feel distant from it, because for me, yeah.
Canada is at war.
Canada's at war too.
Okay.
I mean, the UK is at war. It's an interesting thing for us because we grow up believing that we're not at war, and I don't think that that's a coincidence, and I think it's really significant. And for me, I was in New York during 9/11. I taught high school students during 9/11, and my students made a film about it, and it was very interesting because for them, like Michael Moore's Bowling for Columbine came out right after that, and for students, I think American students, they learn so much from the movies, from, you know, Oliver Stone is our historian for many Americans, you know, and Michael Moore. And, you know, for me, I think there's somewhat of a sort of comic book quality of the way that a lot of young people are learning about history and observing, and I think the Axis of Evil speech feels like comedy, and so does the, you know, Ahmadinejad in Columbia University. We don't have a way to sort of understand these things. And the other thing that I feel is that we're exposed to and have access to so much information now that we don't always know where the historical moment is or where the significance of things are. And I think that, you know, we're just sort of in this sea of moments, and we don't understand how to articulate where is the significance? How does this have meaning? Because in our education we're taught that everything has meaning, and we don't know how to string it together. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting thing. We haven't understood the significance of our time yet. But I call our generation the 9/11 generation. I think it's totally impacted the way young people think. And, you know, I keep reading these articles about our generation looking for meaning in their work. And I think that that's interesting, but I don't understand why it's articulated as we're looking for meaning. In other words, you know, we have meaning, or why don't we understand the significance of it? So, yeah, I think it's an interesting question.
Can I add a point to that one? You know probably the anecdote of Henry Kissinger engaged with, I think it was Zhou Enlai in some of the China negotiations, and Kissinger asked Zhou Enlai what did he think of the French Revolution, and Zhou Enlai said it's too soon to tell. Why do you want significance right away? I mean, it strikes me that it's impossible to measure, no matter how good your conceptual tools are, to measure the question that you put. The impatience is understandable. I see it and value it. But the idea that we can really understand the shape of I think we're the last people to know the shape of our own lives, much less the shape of the societies in which we live. That, I think, is certainly not new. This is something that we can talk about for a long period of time. And on that issue of 9/11, I think one of the things that would be useful around the table in discussion is to explore the notion of war itself. It isn't one thing. It's an extraordinarily multiform, protean, dynamic, ugly, destructive set of very different experiences, which are not the same as the nuclear winter possibility. They're not the same as the Second World War, not the same as the American Civil War, the Peloponnesian Wars. And we tend to use the word as if we all know what it means. And my guess is we don't have very much of an idea of what war is, because every time we speak about it, it changes. And that terrible disorientation of literally loss of focus is built into the nature of the beast. And it makes it harder to talk about, to be sure, but maybe by separating out what war means for an Israeli from 9/11, from what it means in Afghanistan, they're all different. Being at war in Canada over Afghanistan is, we can compare it to other things that we all know about. The language we have is very thin. Wouldn't you agree that it's not a simple matter to handle this issue in a way that would enable us to engage with your points of what is being ignored, or to deal with your work about how war is something that we really do need to consider as a major issue. We've got some hard conceptual work to do, we in general.
I'd like to address something that Karun has said that I think we haven't touched on strongly enough, and that's the integration of social science with government, and how the prescriptive narratives that are based on theories, and especially after Marxism, on setting models, theoretical models of history that have no evidential basis. And so we, somehow or another, in competition, the West incorporated social science into its desire in government. And so what we've had in government is a lot of non-evidential paradigms that come from social science, and they end up confusing many, many issues of truth. And I think that that's part of something that hasn't been discussed enough on how you actually purge it. Because in the time of the Enlightenment, there was no such thing as social science. You know, they said, okay, we have history to learn from, we have evidence to learn from. We don't have a non-evidential theory of government. You know, although they started working out theories of government, they tried to do it on the basis of some form of evidential reality. Whereas once you get to social science, you get these paradigms that are done without any evidence of them being true necessarily, and then hearings will be held. And I know this for a case back on my father-in-law at the time was a good friend of someone who was testifying to Congress on mental health in America. And it was a Senate committee, and they asked him, what percentage of people in hospitals are suffering from mental illness? He didn't know the answer in reality, but he did say, I think it's 50%. And Lyndon Johnson then came on and gave a speech about 50% of people are in mental hospitals. Now, there was no evidence to this particular thing, only the social necessity of creating a model to deal with the issue. And so I don't know how many issues like that at terms of government and the desire of government moved from non-evidential evidence-giving to actual social theory that confuses an awful lot of what we might think is true. So how would you purge government of social science is a very, very important question.
Them's fighting words, wow.
I think, Dr. Badash, I can't see you well, but I so appreciated, your sort of tempering this discussion by saying, yeah, things haven't changed as much as we like to think. I mean, it's not as if history was ever taught in a better way than it's being taught now. And I'm actually optimistic. I think we have more access, as Leva says, people who want to, who know how to teach themselves, how to gather information, how to learn from anywhere, can do it. We have, the histories of events that are being written now far surpass most work that was done 30 or 50 years ago, just in terms of the scope, in terms of the documentary and archival evidence. And there are bad histories, but we can also point to many, many wonderful ones. I don't think that the work that's currently being produced will stand forever. We'll move, I hope, beyond it and improve on it. But I think there are many valuable aspects of postmodernism that we're sort of trying to find a missing link in a way, in terms of thinking about why is it that, well, actually, I don't know if I want to throw out all of these issues at once, but I think maybe we'll come back to these throughout the forum. I was surprised that you started off by saying that people of our generation don't have much knowledge of war because that's not my experience. I grew up in the early 80s, and the experience in the early 80s, I really thought that I would die from nuclear attack. And I think all my peers thought that. And it's not just because I was in NASA towns. That seemed to be typical. Yeah.
We had mass peace rallies and chalk outlines of vaporized people, and I mean, yes.
And then the Gulf War, I think, was hugely influential, or the first Gulf War, in shaping. I mean, I was in 8th grade when it started, and I think that really shaped, really important discussions in a rural school in nowhere, Alabama, on why are we even here? What is the UN? What are our obligations to other member states? I mean, really, really hard discussions.
Yeah, I agree with you. I I remember leading my school out of class during the first Gulf War to join the Berlin protests in '91. But it just doesn't seem to translate into. It doesn't seem to filter through. I mean, it seems to sort of stop somewhere. There's a yes, war is horrible, and not much Auseinandersetzung. There's a German word that means it's sort of to set apart, to set yourself apart from and come to terms with. That's a term. I use coming to terms with as a rough English translation. I don't know if anybody has a better translation for that.
I think this whole idea of coming to terms with is a model that we've erected. We're creating a problem. Like it's sort of what you're saying. Like maybe you and Jeff are concerned about the role of social sciences or theoretical pursuits in academia and government. Like we're creating a problem, and so we can easily find a response to that problem because we haven't looked at all the other possibilities, right?
Well, yeah.
People, but for how long have people thought that it was necessary to come to terms with or find closure after an event? That's a really
well. I think that war is a really good example. I mean, Liba's students are coming to. I don't know what coming to terms is exactly. To me, it's a setting yourself apart from and coming to terms with. So it's taking
moral responsibility for. That's what the term means. Yeah, and that's essential. I don't think that's an option at all.
I think, well...
And it comes from the Holocaust debate. It comes from the supposed silence in German society in the early 50s, which... Both. Yes, they're both used for the same purpose. And we need to take moral responsibility for the fact that war is still a fundamental premise of everyday life. Somewhere in the world, somebody's being killed as we speak. It's there.
I had my first history teacher in university. This is a common question that professors ask: Why do we study history? What's the benefit? So I always start off. I've taught some 40, 50 art appreciation classes at this point. We start prehistory, and I always start that way. What do we stand to benefit from looking at all this old stuff? And most students at this point will give me the cliche response, oh, so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And they're really smug and happy that they say that. But I almost never hear anybody, and this sort of feeds into the idea about reconciliation, I almost never hear anybody sort of give me a really sort of honest response that there's some acknowledgement that the events of the past shape the way we think and interact with each other. And I think that's maybe a key to we're sort of thinking about how do we go forward and how do we, promote
Definitely.
a greater sense of personal and shared history.
I mean, this has come about by me having to live. I've been sort of being forced to live in Germany. I've been living in Canada and other places, and I really haven't had to deal with Germany. I mean, it's just something that I haven't had to deal with. And so this is really coming from a place of this term Auseinandersetzung, which I actually didn't know the provenance of, so thank you. That coming to terms with this history is only it's taking responsibility for it, but not in a remembering the agony and being immersed in it forever way, because actually that I don't know that really does anything for anybody. It's good to remember it, and it's good to have a collective way and a personal family way of remembering it, but it's taking the responsibility of the meaning, and I think we've had enough distance. This is what I'm saying. Our generation has had enough distance now. We have the luxury of having the space to think and to come to terms with and then take responsibility for it. So we need to be pushing on the outer edge now of where should, or what does that moral responsibility mean for human evolution? What does that mean that we are responsible for? Not just simply taking responsibility for the past and remembering it and making amends and all those things that moral responsibility, I mean moral responsibility for the future, not only for the past. So that's what's important. And so if you just are ignorant of it and you just kind of have a flat, thin understanding, sort of a theory, that's what I meant by theory, sort of a very thin, and it's very seductive to young people because it's easy, right? It's easy to just have several theories, and then that you can just interpret current events and the past, and it makes life easier for you. This is hard, and I don't know that, and it means that the outcome isn't prescribed. Like your engagement with the history you're not going to get to the same place as another person's engagement with it. Your personal family and your collective family history and what you study about it might make you arrive at a different place, and I think that's good. I think that's great. I don't think that I'm not suggesting that we now institute some sort of, program of historical indoctrination and coming to terms with it. I think this is an intensely personal statement for me, and I think that's what I intended by it.
There are negative ways of coming to terms as well, and I'm surprised about my experience in the south of Mississippi is that the Civil War is alive and well.
I was actually about to say that.
And the point is, goes to one of your concerns, it has a redemptive narrative of coming to terms, which is the opposite of coming to terms with it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, Hitler gave the Second World War a redemptive narrative. So there are ways of hiding, of not feeling anything because it's all glorified into triumphalism. The fact that the South's blood brotherhood of males in the Lost Cause or the National, the Union, creating the Union, buried the black story of emancipation fully for a century. It was a conjuring trick. It was a lie. And the notion of coming to terms with, in our sense of it, is with something that we recognize as black, as ugly. But there are, unfortunately, all too many institutions that do the opposite. And for very subtle reasons, that they want to make war into something that we can do again.
And there's a very clear
the reenactors, my
God!
Yeah.
Can I share this really short anecdote? One of my longtime mentors as a women's study professor, my first experience with women's studies, sophomore year of college. She came from New England, first semester teaching in Alabama, and she said she felt like she'd done really well, 4 groups of freshmen. Writing composition classes, and she had them do a sort of free essay at the end, and something like 60% of her students wrote about being either a Civil War soldier or a belle, waiting for the soldier to come home, male or female. And she said, I feel like it was a total failure. Like, they didn't learn anything. They learned that maybe they could write a little bit better, but in terms of analyzing, myth making, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to backfill a bit of a story here because, I mean, what I want to get to is your teaching of art to young Nairobians as a form of, and I think the word used is empowerment. Because, I mean, one way of looking at war is that it often emerges out of a sense of injustice. And injustice is often comes from a sense of inequality that's unjustified, that something should be done about. Africa lags the world in many indicators of human well-being and flourishing. You're involved there, and you've tried several approaches, right? You've tried UN approaches. You are promoting entrepreneurial approaches to the world. I know you and I have had discussions about how difficult this is. So I want to come back to art and your sense of going beyond divisive narratives. If you could say just something about that, because I mean it's a big issue, and this, in a sense, is kind of very much what.
I mean, it's on the edge of experimentation, is what I mean. This is far beyond Yeah, I mean, it's a very much an experimental thing that I'm doing, and it's by no means very well thought out. But there are artists who, in their work and in their person, are taking sort of moral responsibility for war. And one of them is a friend of mine from Sudan, who was a former child soldier, and I mean, very directly. I mean, he's a hip hop, sort of rock hip hop artist, so he can speak to young people. And part of his songs are lay down your weapons, and people bring their guns to the concert, and it's like a sort of a disarmament kind of, bring your grenade, bring your AK-47, and so he kind of inspire that because of the authenticity of his own history, right? So that's sort of a really interesting case for me, and I won't go into other details, but that's the kind of thing that I think, if you're looking to, I mean, I work for UN Habitat, and their urban violence is really important. I can't remember who I was talking to about this sort of surfeit of urban males after, in this transition from agriculture to sort of this cash economy. What do all these urban males do, right? And urban females can be recruited into reproductive work quite easily, and they often don't create as much trouble as a bunch of males hanging around with pretty much agricultural sort of skills only. Whereas, if they're in the rural areas, they can be kind of absorbed to a certain extent if it's peasant agriculture. What do you do when you're in the city? You don't have the ability to get the education you need to get into the information sort of knowledge sector, or even the formal sector. Being a mechanic, there probably, even if you did get the education, you still wouldn't find anything. Larry was telling me about a young boy he's sponsoring in Nepal who is educated, now trying to find a job for him, or not him, but he's trying to find a job for himself. So he's educated, but still, it's hard. So you have this male population. This is the kind of thing that I say, okay, well, what can address these people? Yes, sure, we can try with entrepreneurship, we can try with various things. So art is one approach, and I think it's not really art, it's actually the artist. And the artist has to actually be doing it in an authentic way, in and of their own, I don't think it's something you can teach or have a workshop about. All you can do is highlight the work of artists who are doing that, and at least give them some more profile. That's about it. Because really any type of bureaucratization of it becomes very fake very fast.
I think, in more traditional societies, artists sometimes have a different role and sometimes work more collectively. So it's not always the individual remarkable, person who's brought something new, but sometimes that they're just transmitting. They're like more culture bearers, what I would call them. And they can be very significant in social justice movements and in, bringing up new values or transmitting like previous, I would say, values. So I think, like in Kenya, we would find a lot of that. And in a lot of indigenous societies, you find that. But I think as distinguished from probably what we would consider here as artists, individual artists, I would probably call them culture bearers.
That's such an interesting distinction, because I was there's all these groups that are doing, groups of young men, who are doing, I'm sure you've seen them, the anti-violence against women, but they're all men, all young men doing these theater productions. And I don't know if I would call them, I don't know if we could conceive of them as artists. I don't know if it's important, but they are, you're right, bearers of new cultural values, and they are using an artistic form to transmit these values. And at least in Kenya, where I'm familiar, and it's everywhere. I mean, even just remote places, you see this happening all the time. So it's to answer your question, yes, I don't know if it's artistic form. Sometimes it's an individual artist. In my paper, I'm more referring to, I wasn't quite referring to culture so much as how do we reimagine ourselves, and how do we, in the process of taking moral responsibility, imagine consciousness beyond that war. So that requires digging back down into it. And that's the part that I felt like I haven't done and didn't have to do. Sure, I can be horrified at war. Like I said in my paper, sure, I can go to a concentration camp, but there's something of a wall that you hit with just doing that, and not this kind of sort of creative coming to terms with and moving beyond.
I mean, there's nothing simpler than being against war. Gee, golly, you're against war. Although it made a lot of pop musicians a lot of money just to sing a song against war. I get the sense, and this is a bit crazy, but I picture myself in the situation that you're describing, and I can find this sort of idea coming up. If I don't do something artistic, I'm going to kill somebody. I'm going to kick somebody's ass. I'm going to break into something filthy. In some sense, it's a kind of way of expressing or of sublimating the warrior instinct. I mean, I look at the Olympic Games, which occurred in Vancouver, and I see two things occurring there. First of all, there is kind of a gradually emerging sense of, hey, we are this one big species that takes its different forms all over the world. And then we settle down for our wars, which we sublimated in various ways. You guys will fight it out in the hockey rink. You guys will fight it out in the curling rink. You know, all ice. We've loaded the tables for Canadians, right? So we see these two things in tension, and it's an interesting tension in a way, because we constrain and try to control and turn our, as it were, native and natural needs into an art form. And I mean, a worm gets on an apple, digs a hole in, and it's got food, clothing, and shelter, all in one neat step, right? It lives in the apple, it's clothed by it, and it's eating it. We take everything and we turn it into an art form, whether it's eating or clothing or shelter. We turn everything into an art form. And what I see in a way is needed is turning violence into an art form. I know this sounds crazy, but to ritualize it in a way that will satisfy the instinct without. Yeah, I mean, why must it needn't always go to the scientific route? Maybe just a.
Always been an art form.
Mm-hmm.
If you imagine the helmets, imagine the dress, the plumage, imagine the
standards and the
also
horns,
the dignity
drums.
of the men of arms. You know, their notion of comportment and of honor, which I think is a very elaborate art form.
Mm-hmm.
I do wonder. I'd like to hear you elaborate. I'm more resistant to the notion of a warrior instinct than you appear to be. You use the phrase. And I wonder whether there, going back to questions of evidence, whether there's any evidence to believe that there is such a thing called a warrior instinct. There, of course, are thousands of years of warrior practice. But I'd like to know about the genetic material that puts us in there.
That's my presentation for tomorrow. I'm giving it away. No.
Anybody else? Yeah, okay.
By the way, that doesn't close the question.
No.
I think that's interesting what Jeffrey said about just turning that aggression into art, like to take that to another place. I personally find myself doing that at times, mm-hmm. and with working with children sometimes, with painting and that, mm-hmm. and you ask them, well, what is it you get out of this? And it's like, well, I can forget about everything else, and mm-hmm. It opens up a place that's kind of safe and, gets you somewhere else. I'm going to just flip a little bit here, because I liked what Liba said about her culture, and including myself, where you get things out of movies Or I was watching this Frontline program the other night with this bunch of young warriors that came back from Iraq, and they were so screwed up by that whole experience. You know, it just
American warriors?
yeah. It turned a lot of those young men into, like, they ended up in prison because they couldn't stop the killing. You know, they were just so screwed up by that whole experience. And then the night before, I'd watched that movie, The Hurt Locker, Catherine Bigelow's film, and I thought, wow, and here's this guy that he's just like kind of makes an art form out of defusing bombs. And that's like his thing. That's like his art. And he can't even get away from it. He goes home and he's so alienated by everything, he has to go back and continue doing this thing. And then, so at the same time I think about how do you put the lid on Pandora's box, which is created by a lie to begin with. Like you've caused this huge war out of what were, you know, lies to begin with. How do you deal with that? How do you actually get the lid back on that can of worms? It just seems to keep going on. Maybe maybe that's just too big a question.
I think we've been distracted by the display of nature. Jeffrey is now pointing out the fauna in the garden outside. There's a 90, yes, exactly. We are recording that so we can transcribe it for the future. I'm hoping that somebody does have a response to that. I mean, so the war started on lies. It sort of inertially moves on, seemingly very difficult to extricate ourselves from, both in Afghanistan, well, not so much perhaps Afghanistan, but it's I'm assuming you're referring to Iraq. Anyone cares?
Hitler is a painter. Yeah, that's right. In a bad way, that's true. If only he could have stayed there.
Yeah, I know. Unfortunately, that's look out for failed painters.
Not a bad thing to end on. I wonder if anybody has.
I think graffiti art. I think some of it's wonderful, but it has an anti-establishment character to it. And it is a way for some people, anyways. Now, of course, that creates a new battlefront, as it were, amongst city planners, I believe.
I'd like to speak to something of this because Jay and I spoke to this yesterday. You have to be very careful about art because it gives a sense of redemptive qualities that we're trying to avoid, or therapeutic qualities that we're trying to avoid. And the redemptive qualities are extremely dangerous because it gives you the idea that you've redeemed yourself when in fact you haven't answered any of the particular questions that you need to face existentially in facing yourself. So I would be very cautious about the idea of art being redemptive.
Not ever?
I said I would be cautious about it.
Oh, yeah?
Extremely cautious about it and not glib at all because I think it's extraordinarily dangerous.
It has a very long Christian track record, too.
I mean, it seems to be just integrated into everything we do, in a way.
We're talking about art in the modern sense, though. I mean, a lot of the artists that maybe you are interested in highlighting aren't trained in academy, like the Banla hip-hop artists, you know. I mean, that is a legitimate and crucial outlet. And actually, people who are interested in sort of observing Banla culture realize that, or talking, I think I told you this yesterday, a warning of a huge, massive riot 30 years before the 2005 riots, right?
Can you define what Banla is for those who don't know?
These are big suburban developments outside, specifically outside Paris. I can talk a little bit more about what the particular history is there. But most of you probably remember 2005, there for some 3 weeks. This is about right, 3 weeks. There were riots in many of these sort of not connected communities. And most of them are, I guess, now house large numbers of migrant workers and their descendants from North Africa. But the majority of the population might have been shocked by the riots. But again, people who were observing the art that was being produced there, saying actually, the people who are living in these areas aren't shocked. They've known this is yeah, sort of simmering.
Of this, I just was in Philadelphia working with this organization called the Mural Arts Project, and they had a really interesting situation. They work with prisoners in a maximum security prison, and the prisoners wanted to make a redemptive mural in the community, and they make murals inside the prison on these huge pieces of canvas that then get put up on walls. And the woman who ran the organization said she wasn't sure if the people in the community, many of whom were victims of violence, would want the mural from these prisoners. And so she went to the community and asked victims' rights groups and victims if they wanted this mural, and asked them to sort of work with the prisoners to do this project so that it would be like a combined project. And the victims almost unanimously said that they didn't want to do it and that they were really uncomfortable. And a lot of the prisoners who were in the prison were in prison for life for murder. And so it was like this whole big sort of year-long process. And in the end, they, the prisoners made this design for the mural, and the victims said it only represented the prisoners. They were really, didn't like it. And in the end, it's a very long story, but in the end they decided to do 2 murals that sort of faced each other. But what I thought was interesting about it was the victims' decision that they didn't want the prisoners to be redeemed through the work. And that the prisoners were so desperate to have a voice outside of the prison space. And in the end, their 2 murals sort of face each other, and they're very interesting in that they're very different, and they reflect different people and different, concepts. But I think for me, just like sort of thinking about it and thinking, it's not that it's not that I thought that it was art. But it was that I thought that the process was very, very compelling because they had to work together. The victims went to the prison and they worked on both murals together, and they had to have a conversation in the process of it. And so for me, I think that, making the distinction, I think that there can be, it's again like the distinction I'm trying to make with the culture bearers. Like, I don't think it's art, but I think it's a really significant process that people can go through in terms of community building and like finding that dialogue. I think that that's significant, and I do think it's important for people to have that space to create that kind of communication. So I do think it's an interesting thing to think about how people express themselves. I think hip-hop is a really interesting example. There's still a lot of violence in hip-hop. And Jesse and I were just talking about this yesterday, about like kids in Nanaimo, reacting to and appreciating and emulating this sort of warrior behavior, the dance, the music, it's very masculine. And men are attracted to it, and what does that say, even cross-culturally, and hip-hop's traveled all over the world. But what I see is there's still an inherent violence in it. And so, how do we respect it as an art form or understand it, but also as like, it's not out of context. It came from urban violence. It plays into, it's still part of a larger society. It's not just a culture. And
there's so much sort of coding of like sort of state oppression and police surveillance, and it's not just violence among residents, right? I mean, there seems to be a really broad an awareness of a sort of system that maybe people outside of it don't even have. It's quite interesting, yeah. And the same is true, I think, of a lot of American hip hop. But the circulation is an exchange of the music. I mean, maybe not, Jay-Z music gets platinum records every couple of years, but there are a lot of sort of local producers of hip hop that I think are maybe doing important community work that Karun is concerned with.
I mean, I don't know. I tend to agree with Liba that I don't know that I would necessarily consider what these people are doing as being artists in the sense that I referred to in the paper. Jeff was bringing up something he knows about the work that I do, but it's, they would consider themselves artists. They would consider themselves probably, responsible to their community. I mean, the gentleman that I'm speaking of, he isn't inarticulate. I mean, he has, been in conflict and war and has been, I'm sure he's killed people. And the idea that I'm sure that he has some desire to have some kind of personally redemptive experience through taking his form of responsibility, but he also derives benefits from it. So it isn't very straightforward, but it isn't entirely negative, and I think it's worthwhile putting in the toolbox.
It does make difficult the concept of non-prescriptive art that Jeff is talking about. And I think this is a fundamental question of what do you choose between the two. You can't have them both. I really think that one contradicts the other. I don't know if you share that view.
I do, absolutely.
And this is a real choice.
And I'm very aware of it because I've had conversations with Jeff about it. Like I said, Liba gave me a gift of this. I've been really trying to think. I've been looking at the term culture, artists versus, and this idea of culture. But I don't know how you came up, or if that's from something else. I think they're engaging in a dialogue about values. I think it's important to make value statements. I mean, I just don't think that you can escape from making a value statement or a value judgment. So whether or not you put them in the same category as artists, in the sense that Jeff is talking about, for me, I haven't made that judgment. You have. I haven't quite gotten to that judgment yet.
I want to raise this aspect of it that is really important. The concept of non-prescriptive art or non-prescriptive narrative sets art independently of these prescriptive narratives. And so the socially redemptive art, I'm not opposed to it. It's just not the world that I'm talking about. And so this aspect of what this proposal, including for this particular form, raises the issue of a non-prescriptive narrative and the existence of a non-prescriptive narrative. So what we're doing is we're going back and falling back into a prescriptive narrative, which is almost automatic. And part of the problem with identifying art, from my point of view, is growing into the non-prescriptive narrative. And so part of the purpose of this is to arrive at a position, given the knowledge that we have that we're bringing to the table, to a non-prescriptive narrative, because it seems almost always prescriptive narratives as we know them end up in war. So no matter what happens, you're going to end up arguing some factor of absolute truth before or not afterwards, and gradually you're going to degenerate to that particular position. So the desire of finding a non-prescriptive narrative is to deal with the issues of war themselves. And so if it's possible to arrive at a non-prescriptive narrative, then it's also possible to conceive of getting past it. And I don't think we can conceive of getting past it until we do get to a non-prescriptive narrative. So that's how all of this ties together. And it's really interesting on how rapidly you move down through the redemptive thing into a prescriptive narrative, and then back to social science again, overlying, and how there are prescriptions, no matter where we look for prescriptions in terms of who we are, and we consistently fall back into whose prescription, and consistently fall back into the cul-de-sac where we're going to end up to form.
Well,
sorry, no, I think that was very worthwhile.
Yeah, it's almost lunchtime. But hold on, but we want to record your questions.
Yeah, I don't exactly, Jeff. I don't exactly understand what you mean about falling back on a prescriptive narrative. It seems like these things that Karun and Lieber are talking about are coming out of cultures.
Right.
And why is that a prescriptive narrative?
No, it becomes a prescriptive narrative.
In,
Okay.
maybe I'm not sure what the term is.
Well, it's one that I had to articulate last year, and it became one of the fundamentals for dealing with this particular forum. If you deal with a good example of it, and it's in all my work, so that part is okay, but a good example of it outside of my work is Bach abstractions, like the music that we listened to last year. It has no it has no sacred statement in terms of a dictation by, say, a mass would have, right? So it exists independent of a prescriptive narrative other than the prescriptive narrative set by the artist himself. And when the artist does that, the artist then is setting up his own prescriptive narratives and then breaking those down within his own work. I use his, it doesn't matter his or her. So it's dealing with art at the abstract level beyond a prescriptive narrative. And the prescriptive narrative almost always is how do you dictate to the aspect as to what art might or might not be. And when I use prescriptive narrative, I'm dealing with the narratives of the culture itself. So how does art move from the culture itself to a position of a non-prescriptive narrative? A very good example is that Bach music we listened to last year. That's outside of myself. A very good example, of course, is Vaughn's work as well, so it doesn't really matter. We can go all over the place with this one. But artists do move to a non-prescriptive narrative, and it's one of the things that I'm going to try and cover in my presentation tomorrow as well. So that's why I don't really want to skip ahead too much, and would rather make this a discussion for tomorrow.
Sure.
Okay. So prescriptive narratives, generally speaking, are those dictated by a culture. The prescriptive narrative of an artist or an individual artist who goes beyond that aspect of it, then it goes beyond that prescriptive narrative. And the prescriptive narrative usually is the artists themselves. Is what happens in the studio is they will end up knocking that down in order to evolve. So when they're knocking down that prescriptive narrative, it's their own. It's not the cultural one. They've gone beyond that one. And there are very, very many examples. Tomorrow I'm going to just do a short presentation on that idea. Okay. Is that okay?
Oh, sure.
I mean, I'm putting it off, but
I find it's a really exciting discussion. Unlike